What if I told you that the main villain in MHA, Tomura Shigaraki, was actually born quirkless? And what if I also told you that Deku wasn't born quirkless, but his real quirk was stolen by All For One when he was still a baby? In fact, we may have been looking at Deku's real quirk in action since the very beginning of the story, but we just didn't know it because it was being used by someone else. In this video, I will break down some of the most controversial theories in MHA that all fit together and could actually be true. I am willing to bet that one of these theories is not only true, but that it's about to be revealed in the manga very soon. So, let's get into it. You guys know how this works. If you enjoy our MHA content and you want to see more in the future, leave a quick like and comment right now. And if you're one of the over 50% of people who watch our videos regularly but still haven't taken the time to subscribe, remember that subscribing on YouTube is completely free and it means a lot in terms of supporting the channel, so do me a favor and do it right now. Finally, this video will contain Boku no Hero manga spoilers, so please proceed with caution. You have been warned. For several years now, there's been a theory that Tenko Shimura, the young boy who eventually became the villain Tomura Shigaraki, was born quirkless. I've talked about this theory in the past, and other YouTubers talked about it even before me, including my buddy Zonin. According to this theory, the quirk that Tenko eventually manifests, Decay, did not belong to him originally, and it was transferred onto him by the villain All For One without the boy's knowledge or consent. This idea dates back to chapter 235, when the backstory of Tenko Shimura is finally revealed. In a flashback, we see that young Tenko is 5 years old and he still hasn't manifested a quirk, which would indicate that he is actually quirkless. That's because everyone who is born with a quirk manifests it by the age of 4, and not having a quirk after that time normally means that you won't have a quirk at all. 5-year-old Tenko desperately wanted to become a hero, but the odds were certainly stacked against him. For one thing, there was a high possibility that he was born quirkless, and for another, his father, Kotaro Shimura, absolutely forbade both of his children to become heroes. I say both of his children because Tenko had an older sister, Hana, and the father wouldn't even allow them to talk about heroes, let alone become heroes themselves. Kotaro's irrational hatred of heroes stems from his own childhood trauma. Kotaro is the son of Nana Shimura, a pro hero, All Might's former master, and the 7th user of One for All. Little Kotaro loved his mother and was very close to her, but after his father and Nana's husband was killed by All For One, Nana was forced to make a very difficult decision. Because she was a One for All user, she was a constant target for All For One, and she knew that the tragic death of her husband would not be the end. All For One would continue going after her and her family, and her son Kotaro would always be in life-threatening danger as long as he remained close to her. Nana decided to place her son into foster care, and she cut off all forms of communication with him in order to prevent All For One from tracking him down. She also instructed her 2 closest friends, All Might and Gran Torino, to cut off all contact with Kotaro as well. Nana, All Might, and Gran Torino were all being targeted by All For One, and they could all assume that they were always being watched by the villains. If any of them tried to contact Kotaro in any way, there was a strong possibility that All For One would get word of it, and this would lead to him locating Kotaro. So, in Nana's mind, it was either give up her son and never contact him again, or risk him being killed or kidnapped by the villains in their attempt to get to her. She didn't want to give up her son. It was a deeply painful decision for her, but she thought that this was the only way to keep him safe. Her instincts were probably correct because sometime later she herself was killed by All For One in battle, but not before she was able to transfer One for All to her successor, All Might. However, little Kotaro interpreted the situation very differently, and as he got older, he became more and more resentful of his mother and of heroes in general. He felt that his mother abandoned him when he needed her the most. He was very young and impressionable, and he had just lost his father. He needed his mother more than ever, and she just left and cut off all contact with him. Even though she only did this in order to keep him safe, Kotaro believed that his mother chose her career as a pro hero over him, her own son. He never forgave her for this, and he developed the firm opinion that heroes in general are selfish people who neglect and abandon their families in the pursuit of wealth, fame, and glory. When Kotaro grew up and started a family of his own, he made it clear to them that he disapproved of heroes and that there would be no mention of heroes in their home. Needless to say, trying to become a hero was absolutely forbidden. But becoming a hero is exactly what young Tenko wanted, and he would secretly go out and play hero when his father wasn't around. On one such day, Tenko was dropped off at his home by a mysterious man after the boy's pretend heroics landed him into some trouble. The man who dropped Deku off is shown in just a single panel in chapter 235, and we don't see his face. This panel is small and easily forgettable, but it is actually much more important than you think. The person who dropped Tenko off is a large man who wears a suit and a fedora. This very much fits the description of the villain, All For One, at least before he was severely injured by All Might. All For One is a large man who often wears suits, and we also know that he liked to combine his suits with fedora hats. And how do we know this? Well, over 100 chapters later, in chapter 350, we see All For One rescuing a severely injured Toya Todoroki from the fire on Sekoto Peak. In this scene, All For One is wearing a suit and a fedora, and he looks extremely similar to the man who dropped little Tenko off in chapter 235. After getting dropped off by that mysterious man who is clearly All For One, Tenko is scolded by his father. His father was verbally and physically abusive towards Tenko, especially regarding Tenko's dreams of becoming a hero. The shiz really hits the fan after Tenko and his sister Hana sneak into their father's office in order to look at a photo that his father had been keeping there. Their unauthorized visit to the office was actually Hana's idea, and the photo in question was a photo of a young Kotaro hugging his mother Nana, who was wearing her hero costume at the time. This is how Tenko found out that his grandma had been a hero, because his father deliberately refused to share that kind of information with him. When Tenko asks his sister why she wanted to show him the photo, she says that she is on his side, and that she hopes that one day the two of them can form a brother-sister hero team. But when Kotaro finds out that his children snuck into his office, Hana becomes scared and she throws Tenko under the bus. Even though sneaking into the office was her idea, she blames Tenko for everything. She tells her father that going inside was her brother's idea. Kotaro then snaps at Tenko and proceeds to physically beat him. He also says that the woman in the photo wasn't his grandmother but a monster who abandoned her own child. Kotaro says that heroes are people who hurt their own families in the name of helping complete strangers. And as he says this, he continues to beat Tenko. What's more, as Kotaro is doing this, Tenko's mother, sister, and both maternal grandparents watch in horror, but they don't actually do anything to stop Kotaro. They just allow it to continue. After this incident, Tenko is left to sob uncontrollably in the yard as the rest of the family returns inside the house. The only one left to keep a devastated Tenko company is his dog, Monchan. But unfortunately for Monchan, this emotionally charged moment of sadness and despair and anger triggers something within Tenko. His quirk is decay. And because Tenko was hugging his dog at the time, Monchan's body suddenly disintegrates into a bloody mess. Little Tenko is shocked by this. He has never used decay before and he has no idea what's going on. He thinks that Monchan may have been attacked by a villain, and so when his sister Hana comes out to apologize for throwing him under the bus, Tenko reaches out to her for help. But as soon as he touches his sister, the same thing that happened to Monchan happens to her. Tenko's mom and grandparents then also come out to see what's happening. And even though Tenko doesn't actually touch them, he happens to be down on all fours and touching the ground when they come out. Because he was touching the ground, his decay suddenly spreads from the ground onto his mother and grandparents, and all three of them share the same brutal fate as Hana and Monchan. Finally, when Tenko's father comes out to see what's going on, he too is killed by decay. But with one major difference. The deaths of the other members of his family were not intentional. But when Tenko sees his father, he truly snaps. He intentionally approaches his father, touches his face and kills him. He wanted revenge against his father for everything that his father had put him through, and he willfully destroys his father and the house that his father built with his newly manifested quirk. After he killed his entire family and destroyed his home, young Tenko wandered around the city aimlessly, clearly shell-shocked and deeply traumatized. But even though he was just a 5-year-old kid who was obviously in need of assistance, no one tried to help him. No hero or random passerby tried to figure out what happened to this kid. They all seemed freaked out by his appearance, and they just wanted to go about their normal business. The one who noticed the boy and took him in was of course All For One himself, and with the help of Dr. Ujiko, he groomed Tenko into becoming the villain known as Tomura Shigaraki. But is it a coincidence that All For One just seemed to suddenly stumble upon young Tenko Shimura in this moment of crisis? Is it a coincidence that Tenko's quirk suddenly manifested shortly after he was dropped off at home by that mysterious man? No, those were not coincidences. Tenko Shimura was born quirkless, and that is why his quirk did not appear until he was already past 5 years old. The reason why young Tenko was already on All For One's radar at that young age is his connection to Nana Shimura, Tenko's grandmother and All For One's sworn enemy. All For One wanted to mess with Nana's family, and so he was probably keeping an eye on them for a while. He saw that Tenko had serious issues with his father, and that he was a quirkless boy who desperately wanted to become a hero. All For One also knew that he wanted to find a new vessel sometime in the future, and a quirkless boy like Tenko was the perfect candidate. Someone who is set to inherit all the many different quirks that All For One possesses, including the All For One quirk itself, probably needs to be born quirkless. We already know this to be the case with One For All. Those who have a quirk and inherit One For All die young because their body burns out. But those who are quirkless and then inherit One For All can live a full life like All Might did. Since All For One and One For All share a special connection, and since One For All was literally created by All For One, it is likely that All For One shares this characteristic with One For All. Being quirkless is better. On top of that, the immense hatred that was growing inside of young Tenko due to the abuse he suffered at the hands of his father made him the perfect candidate to inherit not only All For One, but also One For All. For many generations, the villain, All For One, has been trying to steal the quirk, One For All, but he always failed because One For All has to be transferred to another user willingly. At some point, All For One concluded that only someone with an immense amount of hatred and willpower inside them is capable of stealing One For All. And so he groomed Tenko Shimura from the young age of 5 to become that type of villain. I'm like 99.9% sure that the Shigaraki was born quirkless theory will be confirmed in the manga very soon, which is why I've talked about it a few times here on the channel. As far as I'm concerned, this theory is true and we're just waiting on final confirmation by Horikoshi. But I know what you're thinking. How is all of this stuff about Shigaraki being quirkless related to Deku? There is another very popular theory out there which states that Deku wasn't actually born quirkless. He had a quirk, but it was secretly stolen from him by All For One when he was still a baby. And because he was so young when it happened, Deku doesn't even know that he ever had it. This theory stems from the fact that Deku's childhood doctor, the one who told him that he was born quirkless in the first place, just happened to be none other than Dr. Ujiko, a villain who has worked directly with All For One for many decades and who is notorious for stealing and copying the quirks of others. When you really think about it, choosing Ujiko in particular as Deku's childhood doctor so early in the story was a very deliberate decision by Horikoshi. And it's certainly possible that he made this decision in order to foreshadow a big reveal in the future. The reveal that Deku wasn't born quirkless after all. I mean, initially we all just believed the doctor's story. Deku has 2 joints in his pinky toes instead of 1, which is an indication that he is among the 20% of people who don't have quirks. The idea here is that humans don't need a second joint in their pinky toe. It is a relic of an earlier stage in our evolution. And so those people who are further up the evolutionary chain will only have 1 pinky toe joint and they will have a quirk. while those who are quirkless still have 2 pinky toe joints. At least that's how I interpreted this whole thing, but I am definitely not an evolutionary biologist. I think of it as kind of like the concept that we don't actually need our wisdom teeth anymore. We needed them back when humans ate raw meats and other harder foods. But this was a very long time ago, and so these extra teeth are now just evolutionary leftovers. About a third of people today are born completely without wisdom teeth, so they are said to be further evolved than those who still have them. And yeah, all of this made sense at first. The doctor shows Deku an x-ray of his foot, he shows him that he has 2 joints in his pinky, and this means that he was born quirkless. But obviously once we learned the true identity of Deku's doctor, things got a lot more complicated. This is a guy who made it his mission to find powerful quirks so that All For One could steal them. He and All For One literally ran an orphanage for kids with powerful quirks who were being raised as backup vessels for All For One in case Tomura Shigaraki didn't work out. This is not the type of guy who should be trusted on this subject. What if the correlation between pinky toe joints and quirklessness isn't actually what it appears to be? We can assume that this idea does exist in the world of MHA because when the doctor says that Deku was born quirkless due to the fact that he has 2 joints in his pinky toe, Deku's mom doesn't really challenge him, since she knows how much becoming a hero means to Deku. We can assume that she would challenge this logic unless she herself believed it to be true, unless she had something to hide, but more on that later. And maybe it is true that the vast majority of people with 2 pinky toe joints don't have a quirk, but what if there are exceptions? What if some children with 2 joints on their pinky toes do have quirks, but these children are just rare? This is something that the general public may not even know about because it's so rare, but someone like Ujiko, a doctor who has been at the forefront of quirk research for over 100 years, would certainly know about this rare occurrence. We can't forget that Ujiko actually has a quirk that slows down his aging process, so he's been alive for over 100 years at this point in time. And if this is the case, if some children who have 2 pinky toe joints do have quirks, then stealing these quirks is literally the perfect crime. Ujiko is a doctor who works with hundreds of children. He finds those rare ones who have 2 joints and a quirk, and he steals that quirk with All For One's help without the child ever noticing. Because the child has 2 joints, everyone just assumes that he or she was always quirkless, and no one ever suspects Ujiko of any wrongdoing. If he can steal the quirk before it even manifests, or before the child is old enough to remember it manifesting, then the child will never know that they had a quirk in the first place. It's actually the perfect crime. So, is it possible that Deku was one of those rare children with 2 joints and a quirk, and Ujiko and All For One stole his quirk before he even knew he had it? Did Horikoshi foreshadow this massive reveal way back in chapter 1 of the story? It's definitely possible, although it's not necessary for the plot, and if Deku really was just born quirkless, it wouldn't make the story any worse. It would just make the fact that his childhood doctor happened to be the villain Ujiko a really big coincidence. I mean, big coincidences do happen in real life, but on the off chance that Deku was born with a quirk, what would his quirk be? It could be his father's quirk, which is fire breathing, his mother's quirk, which was the telekinetic ability to pull small objects towards herself with her mind, or some combination of the two. A popular theory is that Deku originally had some form of pyrokinesis, the ability to generate and manipulate fire with your mind. So it's a combination of his mother's telekinetic quirk and his father's fire breathing, but much more powerful than both of them put together. Imagine being able to set an entire building on fire just by looking at it, or producing and controlling flames from your own body and from anywhere else that you may want to. That would be an extremely overpowered quirk, and just the kind of quirk that both Ujiko and All For One would be extremely interested in. But there is also another option, which is related to Ujiko's own theory, quirk singularity. There are quirks that appear as a result of extremely rare mutations, and they are completely different from the quirks of the user's own parents. They are also usually much more powerful and much more difficult to control, which is where the quirk singularity theory comes in. Quirk singularity theory claims that such rare mutations occur because quirks keep evolving and becoming stronger with each passing generation, and eventually they will become too strong for their users' bodies to handle them, which will lead to widespread chaos and destruction. Aries' quirk Rewind is an excellent example of this phenomenon. Her extremely powerful quirk bears no resemblance to either of her parents' quirks, and it is far stronger and far more dangerous than the quirks of other people in her family. Obviously, the idea that Deku's real quirk could have been a rare mutation leaves the door wide open for speculation about what his original quirk might be. And one popular theory out there is the theory that Shigaraki's quirk, Decay, the one that All For One secretly gave him on the day that he dropped him off at his family home, actually belonged to Deku. Deku was the original owner of Decay, but it was stolen from him when he was just a baby and given to Shigaraki soon after. Now, because Shigaraki is around 5 years older than Deku, and because Shigaraki manifested Decay when he was 5 years old, if Decay was Deku's original quirk, then it must have been stolen from him when he was still just a newborn. As we know, quirks usually manifest at some point before the age of 4, but there are people like the famous luminescent baby who manifested their quirks almost immediately after being born. If Deku had Decay, and it began to manifest when he was still just a newborn, and if Ujiko was there in the hospital at the time of his birth, then Ujiko and All For One could have stolen Decay from Deku when he was just a baby, and Deku would have no way of knowing that he ever had a quirk. As I mentioned earlier, it would have been the perfect crime and no one would have been the wiser. There are even theories that Deku's parents may have asked All For One to remove Deku's quirk because he was so dangerous and uncontrollable. And so he did them a favor like he did to Aoyama's parents when he agreed to give their quirkless son a new quirk. But as we know, All For One demanded a lot in return from the Aoyamas. And perhaps he also demanded something big from Deku's parents. Maybe the real reason why we still haven't met Deku's dad is because he is working off his debt to All For One by doing his bidding somewhere abroad. According to the darkest theory of all, baby Deku accidentally killed his own father when Decay manifested, much like Eri accidentally killed her father using Rewind. Deku's mom then begged All For One and Ujiko to save her son by taking away his dangerous quirk. And she later told him that his father works abroad in order to spare him from the terrible truth, that he accidentally killed his own father when he was just a baby. All of these theories are intriguing, and that last one is deliciously dark. But it also seems kinda hard to believe that someone like Deku, the hero who wants to save everyone and preserve the integrity of the hero society, would happen to have a quirk that destroys everything and everyone that it comes into contact with. It would be very ironic. That said, it would be crazy if during the final battle Deku learns that the quirk which Shigaraki has been using to kill so many innocent people was actually his own original quirk. This kind of revelation would be truly heartbreaking for Deku, and it would make for some amazing shonen final battle drama. What do you guys think? Was Shigaraki born quirkless? Did Deku have a quirk that was stolen by Ujiko and All For One when he was a baby? Was Deku the original user of Shigaraki's Decay? Let me know down below. If you're looking for something to watch next, don't ignore my video on all 20 quirks in Class 1A. It explains every quirk in great detail and includes all the latest updates and upgrades as of the final arc in the story. Don't miss it, link is on screen and in the description. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and until next time, see ya, Space Cowboys.